All right. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Welcome to the public meeting of the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment. And to get us started, I'm going to ask Mr. McNeely to lead us in a prayer. So if everyone can stand.
Dear Lord, guide us through the material that we're working on to develop in the better interest of the Northwest Territories, and be mindful while we do our deliberations of the unfortunate and the ones in the hospital, and also our families back home. Mussy.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. All right, and with that, also for the record, I will get members to introduce themselves, and I'll start on my left.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome, Herb Necamac from the Nukput.
Oh, sorry, Kieran Tester, member for Cam Lake. Good evening.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
Danny McNeely, Satu. Good evening.
And Corey Van Thyn, MLA for Yellowknife North, and the chair of the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment. We also have here with us this evening our staff, the Deputy Clerk, Glenn Rutland, to my right. I also have to my far right our committee clerk trainee, Cynthia James. To my immediate left is our committee advisor, Stephen Dunbar, and to my far left is our law clerk, Toby Kruger. And so today, today the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment is holding a public clause-by-clause review of Bill 38, the Protected Areas Act. Bill 38, Protected Areas Act, proposes to establish new legislation that will allow the GNWT to create permanent protected areas in the NWT where there are important plants, animals, land, cultural, or historical sites. It also allows for co-management of protected areas with an Indigenous government or organization. This bill says what is allowed to happen in protected areas and what is not allowed. Mining exploration, oil and gas development and exploration, and energy developments are prohibited. Small-scale renewable energy projects may be developed within a protected area or by an adjacent community. Roads or power lines may be permitted with consultation of the Protected Areas Management Board. Bill 38 received second reading in the Legislative Assembly on February 26, 2019, and was referred to the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment for review. The committee sent letters inviting input from an extensive list of stakeholders, including municipal and Indigenous governments in the Northwest Territories and a number of non-governmental organizations. Between May 23rd and June 2nd, 2019, committee traveled throughout the territory and held public hearings in Fort Smith, Katloditchi First Nation, Hay River, Fort Providence, Betchiko, Inuvik, and Norman Wells, and Yellowknife. Committee thanks everyone who attended these meetings or provided written submissions to the committee sharing their views on Bill 38. There are copies of the bill available on the side desk if you haven't helped yourself already, near the back of the room. Committee would also like to thank the Minister of Environment and Natural Resources and his staff for the collaborative approach on the review of Bill 38. The committee and the department have worked closely to expedite the review of this important legislation. This expediency has not come at the cost of a thorough review of the bill. Through our consultations and deliberations, it was clear that there were areas where improvements were necessary, and committee is pleased to be bringing forward amendments that will improve the bill and create better legislation for the residents of the Northwest Territories. I will now invite the Honourable Minister of Environment and Natural Resources to introduce himself and your staff for the record and proceed with any opening remarks you may have. Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and good evening, committee. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to provide information to committee on Bill 38, the Protected Areas Act, from the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. With me today, I have Mr. Robert Jenkins, who's the Assistant Deputy Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Kelly McLaughlin, Legislative Counsel. We also have Rohan Brown, Legal Counsel. Seth Benet is the Manager of Legal and Legislation. Christine Glowich is with us, Legislative Initiatives Lead. Michelle Swallow, Manager of Conservation Planning. Julian Kennigan is the Director of Environmental Stewardship, and my Ministerial Special Advisor, Mr. Rob Collinson, is also here with us. This bill sets out the processes for establishing a protected area in the Northwest Territories. The bill lays out the process to nominate a candidate area, how establishment agreements with Indigenous governments or organizations will be entered into for management of a protected area, regulation making authorities, and prohibited and acceptable activities in a protected area. Environment and Natural Resources has developed the bill through a partnership process with a technical working group that is comprised of Indigenous governments and organizations and renewable resource boards. Valuable input was also received from a stakeholder advisory group, public engagement, consultation with Indigenous governments and organizations, and other GNWT departments. The department appreciates all comments and recommendations provided through the committee process and looks forward to providing answers to committee's questions and concerns. Thank you, Mr. Chair. That concludes my opening remarks.
Thank you, Minister. Much appreciated. Does the committee have any general comments or questions before we begin the clause-by-clause review? Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I think it's fair to say that there's been high public interest in this bill. We received 26 written submissions. We visited 8 communities. There's going to be a lot of amendments proposed this evening. We did agree to expedite the process of reporting this bill back into the House, and I support that effort on the part of the committee and the minister to do that. And I think it's largely in recognition of the need to try to move forward quickly on Thai-Dene. I support that, and I think that this is a good start to helping build a conservation economy for the Northwest Territories. So I think the other remarkable thing about this piece of legislation is that it is a product of co-drafting between the Indigenous governments, the relevant co-management bodies, and the territorial government. And I think it's the way that we need to move forward with other phases of implementing this legislation in the post-devolution world. I think the value that committee has brought to this bill rests in a few different areas that I'd like to just talk a little bit about. I think we approached this with a few different lenses when we were reviewing the bill as a committee, and I can't speak on behalf of all the committee members, but certainly these are the lenses that I used. I think we really wanted to make sure that the concept of co-management was truly recognized and incorporated into the bill. So I think we have agreed with the minister on a number of ways to better incorporate co-management into the bill this evening. So I think we've also found ways to build in greater accountability through providing reasons for decision at some key points in the bill. There's also, I think, a move towards greater transparency and access to information. And I think we're going to see that around the public registry in particular. We've also, I think, when we looked at this, I wanted to make sure that there were opportunities for public involvement in the key steps and phases of considering the establishment of protected areas, but also how they might be managed into the future. So I think that we'll end up in a better place after this evening and look forward to the discussion and debate. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Further comments, questions from committee? Mr. Testart.
Thank you. We'll just move that briefly. Okay. I appreciate the work that both sides of the House have put together on this bill. I think the best legislation comes out of collaboration and compromise, and the fact that we're able to move expeditiously on Bill 38 just demonstrates that in year 4 we have gained a certain skill set to allow us to collaborate on bills effectively. There are a few outstanding issues that my colleague and I agree on, and we'll be addressing those later. But I did want to address the co-drafting function of this bill. I spoke in the House about this recently, about all the public consultation we've heard from Indigenous governments and organizations, that this bill and the process that brought it about represents the realization of the GNWT's efforts to reconcile with Indigenous peoples and nations. And that's a very powerful statement that shouldn't be taken lightly. The one sticking point that that is still uncertain for me is how regulations arising from these bills, not just this one, but the whole suite of bills that have been brought forward, are going to be handled. There's a strong desire from Indigenous governments to participate in regulation-making authority. A great deal of these bills are foundations for regulations that are really going to determine where the rubber meets the road. So I'm wondering if tonight, if the minister can share any of the government's plans for engaging Indigenous governments in co-drafting regulations or engaging them in a similar technical working group style body for the development, the collaborative development of regulations. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and we will be dealing with this later, but the Intergovernmental Council has undertaken a lessons learned process on the development of post-evolution legislation where a common process should be developed around land, water, and resources legislation. Any approach to regulation development needs careful consideration and consistency to be one of the issues, will be one of the issues discussed. The approach is part of the consideration involving relationship between the GNWT and Indigenous governments.
Thank you, Minister. Anything further from committee before we start clause by clause? Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would also like to thank all the stakeholders and all the involved parties bringing us to this document with the suggestions, and also being mindful of several other jurisdictions that we have out there being non-claimant areas and claimed areas, and to respect the documents of the claimed areas, which sets out a process for anything that is going to reflect on change within the respective jurisdiction. And over the past several years, we've seen the IGC get set up, get running, having meetings, holding sessions, and only to find out that this is a system of engagement. And I feel that system of engagement reflects the parties that are sitting at the table. And it defines the willingness of this government to engage consultation with the representatives and the parties within that council. And to broaden our jurisdiction involvement into some of the legislation that changes that are being proposed would only enlarge the parties involved to the system, which makes it viewed as cumbersome, as bureaucratic, and it undermines the intent of the land claim to involve one or more co-management groups within the administration of those respected areas. So I'm also mindful of that, and I'm glad we're moving ahead to conclude this legislation in the remaining few days that we have for this spring session. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. Next I have Mr. Nakamayak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have much really to say, maybe a rant, but nothing more. You know, Mr. Chair, is, you know, pretty passionate about climate change and, you know, protected areas, and also coming from a signed land claims agreement. I noticed that I know just by being the person that I am, you know, living in the region I live in, and you know how good we have it once we have a signed land claims, as opposed to Indigenous governments or Indigenous claims that are not signed. And you know the benefit that we have, that we carry, and the things that we can focus on, rather than where are we at negotiation stage. And I hope this is a reflection of the government, you know, working towards helping Indigenous governments. I wouldn't say towards their own self-determination, but to their own working towards self-government and building capacity. And this has been one of them. This is listening to the issues around the territory. The differences are far and wide. of involvement at times at the table for, say, for the Unival. That's my region, and I'm grateful that we're able to participate. And I'm actually, quite grateful that the department works with the Unival Game Council, with FJMC, with all these organizations that kind of, I wouldn't say co-manage. We cannot do enforcement along the Tuck Highway. We have the monitoring system, and I think those are all areas where we could look at and maybe 5, 10, 15 years down the road, start to plan so that we can actually, I wouldn't say police, but maybe do some types of enforcement or some type of a developmental planning, not just for that region, but for all across the territory. And when you have that capability, then you could develop these so much more in respect to the Indigenous people, in any specific region. So I'd just like to thank the department for allowing us to do our part in this and have our say. So that's all I have, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nakamaiak. Thank you to committee for general comments. Does committee agree that we now conduct a clause-by-clause review of Bill 38 Protected Areas Act? All right, committee agrees. We will defer the title of the bill until the end and begin with consideration of the clauses. There are 101 clauses in the bill. We will group the clauses where possible. I ask that you please turn to page 9 of the bill. Is everyone in place? All right. Clause 1. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm wondering if I can ask the minister, this is the definitions contained in the bill. There is a definition for Renewable Resources Board, and I'm just wondering why there was no definition for a land use planning board or body contained in the bill as originally drafted. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Sorry, who's? Okay. Mr. Jemson? Jenkins, sorry, I apologize. Mr. Jenkins.
Thank you. No worries, Mr. Chair. So the Bill 38 currently does not define land use planning board or body. That was not defined as it was felt that the term did not require further clarification and to avoid omitting current or future land use planning boards or bodies. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Further, Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Well, it's kind of curious because Renewable Resources Board actually does have a definition in here, and of course they are to be notified, engaged at various stages in the process. So why would Renewable Resources Board get a definition in here and not Land Use Planning Board or body? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So there's a definition of land use planning board. There's also a definition of renewable resources boards. Those are terms that are defined and entities that are established through land claim agreements. There are currently for example, two land use planning boards created under land resources and self-government agreements. However, in the future, it's possible that there could be new land use planning boards and bodies created other than through land resources and self-government agreements. So we felt that there was not a need to define land use planning board or body to avoid omitting current or future land use planning boards or bodies. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Further, Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I guess, the Mackenzie Valley Resources Management Act, the Gwich'in and Sawtoo agreements do establish land use planning boards for their two settlement areas. But in the Tlicho agreement, and I'll just give you an example here, section 22.5.3 reads as follows: the parties may by agreement establish a land use planning body and a mechanism for preparation, approval, and implementation of a land use plan that applies to all of Waikiki other than national parks. So why is the Tlicho agreement is one of the enumerated land resources and self-government agreements found in the bill? So why not include a definition of a land use planning body in the bill, or at least recognize that There's provision for one in the Clecho agreement. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So there hasn't been a body created yet under that agreement. There could be one in the future, as you referenced. There could be one in the future in other areas. To ensure that there's appropriate tailoring to each protected area context, as well as ongoing post-establishment relationships with both renewable resource boards and land use planning boards, that could be defined in individual establishment agreements and reflected in regulations as well moving forward. The difference between a land use planning board and a renewable resources board, again, there is provisions in land claims for those. With respect to bodies, they may or may not be established in the future. There's a number of provisions within the Act that references both a board and a body and provides for notices and engagement throughout the Act, and we feel that those provisions do provide the necessary means to notify and engage with those bodies as we move forward through implementation of this legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Anything further, Mr. O'Reilly?
Yeah, thanks. At the risk of flogging perhaps a dead horse here, I raised this issue of what was happening with land use planning in the Wekajee management area with the Minister of Lands, who has responsibility for land use planning. I raised this in the House on Thursday. And the answers that I got from the Minister was that there's, I believe, a draft terms of reference that's been negotiated for a land use planning body. They're going to call it a committee in the the Wekajee management area. This government has approved, we've approved $700,000 towards the startup cost of that land use planning body. And this is an effort that looks like it's almost ready to begin. So why would we not recognize a land use planning body in this bill? Or do we have to wait for that committee to be formally established and then we're going to have to amend the bill? Thanks, Mr. Chair. Or amend the Act at that point. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. One more time, Mr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So if a land use planning body is established, for example, under the Wekajee, as per the Clecho Agreement, the relevant sections of the Act still would apply. In addition to the requirements under the land use plan, notice will be provided for candidate areas, intention to establish protected areas, and changes to the size or delisting of protected areas, as well as for the process for preparing management plans. We would consider any and all feedback received from land use planning boards or bodies on protected areas. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Further, Mr. O'Reilly?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Obviously, we're not going to resolve this tonight, and it's going to have to move to the floor of the House again. But I guess I think it's actually disrespectful that we don't recognize that there's provision for a land use planning body in the Clecho Agreement in this bill, in the definition. And that's all. I'll just leave it at that. There's obviously a difference of opinion here about how this should be set out in the bill, and I'll continue the debate and discussion on the floor of the House. We're not going to resolve it here this evening. Thanks, Mr. Chair. And look, I do respect my colleagues working for ENR. This is not personal in any way. This is I guess, a disagreement about how we properly recognize and incorporate the land and resources and self-government agreements that have already been negotiated as part of this bill moving forward. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Comment noted. Next to have Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just following up from my colleague's comments, so you've said that the bill already does all the things that have been raised by Mr. O'Reilly's concerns. So what is the harm of including this? It seems like if the bill's already doing it and this just adds additional clarity, what are the consequences of including bodies in the definition that is a risk to the public's interest? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the way that the definition is laid out, that in essence, there can be bodies that are created in the future, under future land claim agreements or other types of processes that aren't necessarily established under a land claim agreement. So this is why having, within the Act, having provisions that reference a board or body provides the flexibility that you will still have to undertake those requirements, but it also is forward-looking, where we do not know, in essence, whether some of those bodies will be defined as per a land claim agreement. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Anything further, Mr. Testart?
Yeah, I just, I'll leave this as well, but I mean, I understand that, and it sounds like the intention here is to provide flexibility for whatever future agreements may come. But I still don't understand why including body as a definition, just to provide additional clarity to, let's say, the Talicho agreement, which is quite explicit on this point, that it's not a board, is at cross purposes with the integrity of the regime we're setting up. And I remain unconvinced. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Comment noted. Anything further on Clause 1? Call it again, Clause 1. Mr. O'Reilly.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to move a motion to amend Clause 1. Shall I read it out?
Just one moment. All right, thank you. There's a motion. The motion is order. To the motion. Oh, sorry, Mr. O'Reilly.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I don't think I've actually read it, so I think I need to do that. That subclause 1 bracket 1 of Bill 38 be amended in the definition land resources and self-government agreement by A, striking out or at the end of subparagraph A, Roman numeral 5, B, striking out the semicolon at the end of paragraph B and substituting or, and C, adding the following after paragraph B, C brackets, any prescribed legally binding agreement. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. The motion is in order. To the motion. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, the real effect of this motion is to include an additional catch-all for any land resources and self-government agreement. This will allow the minister to prescribe additional legally binding agreements that could be considered land resources and self-government agreements for the purposes of this bill. The ones that are recognized in here already are the Gwich'in, Nuvialuit, Sahtu, Tlicho, Delaney agreements. This would provide some additional ability for the minister to recognize other agreements. And I want to say that this was requested specifically by the Katlo-Deche First Nation, and I think it's a good way to provide some additional flexibility moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Does the minister concur with the amendment? Thank you, Minister. The minister concurs with the amendment. All right, committee, to Clause 1 is amended. Does the committee agree? Thank you. Sorry. Did I miss a? Okay. Clause 1 as amended, does committee agree? Oh, I see. No, one moment.
Another motion.
Baby steps. Does committee agree? Mr. Nakamayak?
I have a little bit of, Mr. Chair, I think we have a little bit of differences about this land use planning board, but I guess I will read it out for the sake of this, Chair. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, I move that subclause 1, brackets 1 of Bill 38 be amended by adding the following definition in alphabetical order. Land use planning board means a board established by or under a land resource and self-government agreement that is composed of members who are designated, nominated, or appointed by an indigenous government or organization, and members who are appointed by government, and that has a role respecting land use planning in the area of the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. The motion is in order. To the motion, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I support this motion, notwithstanding the previous discussion about, I do believe this should be expanded to include or body, which is the way that the Peleacho agreement has defined their land use planning function to be carried out in the future. But this is consistent with the definition that's already in the bill for Renewable Resources Board. So I think this is something that should be added, and I do support it. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. To the motion? Question has been called. Question has been called. All those in favor? Thank you. All those on the motion carries unanimously. Does the minister concur with the amendment?
Sure.
Thank you, Minister. The minister concurs. Committee, to clause 1 as amended, does committee agree? All right, thank you. Clause 2. Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that clause number 2 of Bill 38 be amended by adding, for the benefit of current and future generations after, intended to be permanent. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. The motion is in order. To the motion. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is feedback that the committee received during our consultations with the public, and we heard from many interested residents and who are very live to the ever-changing climate issues in the Northwest Territories and the concerns around intergenerational equity. And that was a concept that was presented by a number of different witnesses before the committee. And the intention behind this motion is to ensure that the bill reflects the need to contemplate intergenerational equity in how protected areas are managed, and to ensure that the land is preserved for future generations, to maintain our heritage, our culture, and the ecological integrity of the environment for generations to come. So I support this motion, and I'm glad to see it come forward today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Further, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, this concept was specifically suggested to us by a number of non-governmental organizations, and CPAWS, Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, NWT chapter, specifically requested that this be added in. This is language that's found in the federal legislation for national parks. It's found in many of the provincial and territorial laws that establish protected areas as well. So I think it's just consistent with best practices. It's also found in the preamble to the bill as well, and I just wish that more of the preamble found its way into the actual purpose statement, section 2 as well. But I do support this. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you. Anyone further to the motion? To the motion. Question. Question has been called. All those in favor? Thank you. Motion passes unanimously. Does the minister concur with this amendment? The minister concurs with the amendment. Thank you, Minister. Committee, to clause 2 as amended. Does committee agree? Agreed. Thank you. Let's go clauses 4 to 8. will amend that, sorry. All right, to Clause 3?
Agreed.
All right. Okay, Clause 3, agreed. Does committee agree? We got to put a vote, right? Sorry, hold on a sec. This is what happens when you sit on a script and then you go off scripts. Okay, Clause 3, committee agree? Agreed. Okay, sorry? Now we can move on. All right, sorry about the delay, folks. Okay. Apologize. Now we're going to move to clauses 4 through 8. Committee? Thank you. Clause 9. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that subclause 9, brackets 2 of Bill 38 be deleted and the following substituted. Brackets 2, the protected areas registry shall contain the following information. A, all information respecting candidate protected areas required by Section 12. B, all information respecting established protected areas required by Section 18. C, any reviews of candidate areas conducted or any removals of candidate areas made under Section 13. D, any establishment agreements entered into under Section 14, which may be redacted to exclude the disclosure of 1, ecologically or culturally sensitive information, the disclosure of which would be prohibited pursuant to the Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act, or 2, information harmful to the financial or economic interests of a party to the establishment agreement, the disclosure of which would be prohibited pursuant to the Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act. E, any materials created for the purpose of public engagement under sections 16, 24, 26, or 36. F, any notices given to and responses received from a land use planning board or body or renewable resources board pursuant to section 12, 16, 26, or 36. G, any reports tabled under section 20. H, all documents that are produced, collected, or received by a management board established or designated for each protected area under Section 21, or by an advisory body established under Section 23, if, 1, the management board or advisory body and the minister have reasonable grounds to believe that it would be in the public interest to disclose the document because it is required, or would be beneficial for the public to effectively monitor the management of the protected area, or 2, the document constitutes formal correspondence to or from the management board or advisory body related to the management of the protected area. I, all public draft and final management plans prepared under subsection 24.1 and any reviews of those plans conducted under paragraph 24.2E. J, any interim management guidelines established under section 25. K, any notices given and determinations made respecting changes to a protected area under section 26, including a map and the size of the area of the change. L, any notices given and determinations made respecting the establishment of a transportation or transmission corridor under section 36, including the minister's reasons for decision under subsection 36 brackets 6. M, any reports tabled under section 97. N, any other information the minister considers necessary. O, any other prescribed information. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. The motion is in order. To the motion. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is a much larger section that I just read out than was originally included in the bill. And there was a high desire for public transparency around the creation of a protected areas public registry. And this came from all sources, including the minerals industry, the NGO community that presented before committee, and indigenous governments as well, and private citizens. And also was the strong desire of many committee members to see the GNWT continue its commitments along the road to transparency and open government, and to ensure that there's a single repository of information. So what committee did was take a look at the act and find all the pertinent decision points that would be important to allowing the public to understand how decisions related to conservation under or within a protected area are made, and to ensure all of those decision points fed into a robust public registry, which is why this amendment, the original section, which has 2A and B, has now been is now being amended to O. And this seems like a lot of work, but it is all work that's undergoing anyway. This just ensures that work is public and can be easily and carefully considered by the public as well, who want to see what's really going on with the coming conservation economy and these protected areas that are going to be around for future generations. So it's important that this entire process is as public and transparent as possible. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Further to the motion, Mr. O'Reilly.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, first off, I want to recognize the work of our staff with the minister's staff to broaden this list from what was originally contained in the bill. And I think it was a collaborative process developing what we see in this motion. Northerners have really come to expect that when it comes to the management of resources that a lot of information is made available. And we see that with the land and water boards. They have public registries with extensive amounts of material that are available there, right from original licensing, inspections, plans that are submitted pursuant to licenses, renewals, public hearing transcripts, all kinds of information. Review Board, the Mackenzie Valley Environmental Impact Review Board does the same thing with its public registry. So Northerners have actually come to expect to see this level of detail in management of our resources. And I think this set of changes will accomplish meeting that expectation of Northerners. And we did hear that from the NWT Nunavut Chamber of Mines. They wanted a detailed registry. We heard it from the NGOs as well. So I think this is a very good effort on the part of the committee and the minister to allow for greater accountability, transparency, and access to information. So I support this. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Further to the motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? Thank you. All those opposed? Motion is carried. Does the minister concur with the amendment?
Yes, I do, Mr. Chair.
Minister concurs with the amendment. Thank you, Minister. Committee to Clause 9 as amended. Does committee agree? Mr. O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that subclause 9, brackets 3 of Bill 38 be deleted and the following substituted. Bracket 3, the Protected Areas Registry must be made available to the public by posting it on a website, and information that is required to be included in the Protected Areas Registry must be added to the website without delay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. The motion is in order. To the motion. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Once again, this is simply in line with good practice. Best practices, as I alluded to earlier, in terms of what the Land and Water Board and the Review Board already do, in terms of making information submitted to them available on the internet on a public registry. So that's what this amendment will do. And there's also some additional wording in here with regard to without delay, so to ensure that there's the timely placement of information on the registry so that everybody can know what's taking place. Thanks, Mr. Chair. I support it.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. To the motion? Question. Thank you. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Thank you. Does the minister concur with the amendment? Yes. Thank you. The minister concurs with the amendment. Thank you. Committee to Clause 9 as amended. Does committee agree? Mr. Nakamayak.
Sorry, yeah, okay. Chair, Mr. Chair, I move that Bill 38 be amended by adding the following after subclause 9 brackets 3. Nothing in this act requires a document to be included in the Protected Areas Registry that A, is prohibited from non-disclosure or any other act of Northwest Territories or Canada, or B, contains information that is provided implicitly or explicitly in confidence to the person or body exercising powers or performing duties or functions under this act, and is consistently treated as a confidential information by the party providing the information. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Nakamayak. The motion is in order. To the motion? Question? Question has been called. All those in favor? Thank you. The motion is carried unanimously. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
The minister concurs with the amendment. Thank you, Minister. Committee to Clause 9 as amended. Does committee agree? Agree. Thank you, committee. Committee, Clause 10. Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that clause number 10 of Bill 38 be amended, brackets A, by adding the following after subclause, brackets 1, and 1.1, an area nominated under this section shall be considered by the minister without delay, brackets B, in that portion of subclause, brackets 2, presiding paragraph, brackets A, by striking out may and substituting shall.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. The motion is in order. To the motion, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, this is about the nomination phase of protected areas, and we had some discussion of this as a committee, and I think we went back and forth, and we with the minister on this as well, and certainly have a better appreciation of how the nomination process is going to work. And this is meant to be a timely process where an Indigenous government and or GNWT can put forward an area for consideration. And while it's being considered, though, it's basically a confidential process. We don't want word to get out because there's no interim protection for these areas. We want to ensure that the integrity of those areas are protected. So these small amendments will help, I think, move along consideration of these areas a little bit more quickly, and also require the minister to consider, the minister shall consider an area for approval rather than may, without any time limit being placed on it. So I do support this amendment, with having gained a better understanding of what the nomination phase is supposed to be all about. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. To the motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? Thank you. Motion passes unanimously. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
The minister concurs with this amendment. Thank you, Minister. Committee to Clause 10 as amended. Does committee agree? Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I move that Clause 10, bracket 2 of Bill 38 be amended by deleting paragraph B and substituting the following. B, if the minister is satisfied that the area meets the purpose of this act unless Roman numeral 1, in the case of a nomination by an Indigenous government or organization, the nominating party has no asserted or established Aboriginal right or title in the area nominated. The nomination covers, Roman numeral 2, the nomination covers all of the public land within an area of asserted or established Aboriginal right or title. Roman numeral 3, the nomination is frivolous, vexatious, or malicious. Roman numeral 4, the nomination is solely within municipal boundaries. Or Roman numeral 5, the nomination does not meet any prescribed eligibility criteria. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. The motion is in order. To the motion, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just a minute ago, I talked about the nomination process a little bit and the need to try to move through that quickly. And I think what this amendment does is provide the minister with a list of reasons for basically, or a checklist for considering a nomination. And if something doesn't meet these sorts of purposes here, then the minister has grounds to reject an area. So this is really about clarifying the minister's discretion under the bill and ensuring that if an area meets the criteria set out, then it moves on into the candidate process so that there can be full public consideration of a candidate area, and another decision point can be made about whether to actually establish it as a protected area or not. So this is just about clarifying the minister's discretion. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. To the motion, Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we talked, in studying the bill, we carefully considered all the stages of protected areas establishment, and concern I initially had is the nomination process is entirely in secret, which I felt was a disservice to the public who want to know what's going on in the Northwest Territories, especially around something as significant as putting an area into a protected status. Now, in understanding things better, it became clear that the nomination, there's good reasons why the nomination period needs to remain confidential, but there is a great deal of ministerial discretion here. When committee spoke to the minister about this issue, we were given a general list of what those concerns would be, and I feel it's appropriate to codify that quite clearly. This is not a limit. I don't see this as a limit on the minister's discretion. Rather, it is to provide guidance to the minister's discretion, so it is clear and consistent. And that's one of the concerns we hear often about our regulations in the Northwest Territories, that we need clarity and consistency, so everyone knows exactly what to expect from the process. And I think this quite clearly lays out all of the concerns that the government has around the nominee, basically, for lack of a better word, a nuisance nomination, or a nomination that might not be fully considered or have other economic and political consequences. This makes it very clear to anyone, any Indigenous government or public government who is proposing a protected area, that these are the steps they clearly need to follow. And if they don't, the minister has the ability to reject the nomination. I think it's clear, I think it's concise, and I think it's a much needed improvement to the bill. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. To the motion, next I have Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This existing legislation is already is happening to establish two candidates in two different areas. If one would really think about it, and I had some reservations about this particular change here when I reflect and look back at the two candidate areas, the Rampart wetlands above Fort Good Hope and the Tyendinaene. So you have two jurisdictions following the very existence of this legislation, and progress is being made. So I'm thinking to myself, progress is being made because maybe the regulatory system is compensating the legislation system. So what's the logic to the change for something that's already happening? So I just wanted to point that out to say, what is existing, it's working. It must be working. We've got two candidates. So I just point that out there. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Comment noted. To the motion, Mr. Nakamayak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with the previous speaker. I think the minister would be crazy to take away some of his discretion. Also, for me, coming from where I sit, I think this is sort of imposes on the government-to-government relationships that the GNWT and the Inuvialuit and other Indigenous governments have, so I won't be supporting this. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Right. Nothing further to the motion. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I just want to point out that under 10.6 of the bill, the minister may, in the minister's discretion, reject a nomination made under this section. So the minister has total unfettered discretion already under 10.6. I think what this attempts to do is to provide a checklist for how the minister should consider a nominated area. I would also point to Roman numeral 5, where the nomination does not meet any prescribed eligibility criteria. So that, in addition, the minister does have the ability to bring forward regulations in the future that might prescribe additional or different additional eligibility criteria in the future. If the list here doesn't necessarily capture everything that might happen. But yeah, we went back and forth with the minister on this, and we had hoped that we could reach an agreement. We may not be able to, but I think this is in the interest of trying to move an area through the nomination process quickly and get it some interim protection to it, and then allowing the public to have their say. And the minister still has the discretion at the end of the day, even in the candidate status, to decide whether a protected area is going to move forward or not. So that's another check in the process. So I think this is a good amendment. And Mr. Chair, this may be a bit unusual, but I'm wondering about whether we might have a recorded vote in committee for this. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
I don't see why we can't honor that request. And I think what we can do is just have folks raise their hands clearly, and we'll record that. All right, to that, Mr. Testart.
Yeah, just, I guess it's not a formal point of order, but the Rule 93 forwards the rules and procedures of the Legislative Assembly shall be observed in committee, and Rule 67 governs recorded votes, and how this plays out is the chair will call each member. So same way that it works in the House would be appropriate, and that's backed up by Bashane's Parliamentary Rules and Forms, 6th edition as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart, for that clarification. All right, just one moment. If there's nothing further to the motion, question has been called. All those in favor, please raise your hands.
Member for Cam Lake. Sorry, the member for Frame Lake and the member for Cam Lake.
Thank you. All those opposed?
The member for Sawtoo, the member for Nunavut.
All right. So, the vote is tied. Pursuant to Rule 66.3 of the Rules of the Legislative Assembly, as Chair of the Standing Committee, I will cast the deciding vote and may state the reasons for my vote. Unlike members who cast votes according to their own views, I will vote in a manner which maintains the confidence of committee in my role as an impartial chair. The general principle applied to these situations is that the chair votes to maintain the status quo. In this case, that means voting to leave the bill in its existing form rather than causing it to be amended. This leaves open the opportunity for further debate at Committee of the Whole. As a result, I vote against the motion, and the motion is defeated. Thank you, committee. Committee to Clause 10 as amended. Does committee agree? Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I move that Clause 10, bracket 6 of Bill 38 be deleted and the following substituted. Bracket 6, the minister shall make a decision to accept or reject a nomination within 90 days of receiving the nomination, and the minister shall provide written reasons for a rejection to any nominating Indigenous governments or organizations. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. The motion is in order. To the motion, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. We just had a discussion around ministerial discretion in the nomination phase. What this amendment would do would be to remove the minister's unfettered discretion, because in the current, the way the bill reads now, it says the minister may, in the minister's discretion, reject a nomination made under this section. So that the minister can reject a nomination for any reason whatsoever. Now, the minister does have to provide written reasons to the nominating Indigenous government organization, and that is maintained in the amendment. But rather than have the minister have unfettered discretion, what this does is place a 90-day time limit. Well, the minister would still have discretion under 10.2B, but this would also put on a 90-day time limit to make a decision, and that's in an effort to try to move a nominated area along quickly to ensure that the public has a say in it and that its integrity is protected, because these areas don't have any protection while they're in the nomination phase. So we're seeing increasingly common where there are time limits placed on decision-making as part of good environmental, good resource management legislation, the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act being one. We just talked about time limits as well in the Assembly about access to information, protection of privacy, where there's very clear timelines set out to make sure that there's timely decisions made. And that's what this amendment is really about, is making sure that there's a clear timeline for making a decision, and that's what it's all about. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. To the motion? Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My comments to this amendment here is similar to the ones that I previously stated on the previous motion, and I'm quite satisfied with the current administration. I don't see a regulatory need to bring regulations into an amendment or into the Act. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. Next, I have Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I too support this motion. I think it works better with the preceding motion, but I won't reflect on that division. Rather, I will say that having a clear timeline, again, improves consistency and clarity of the Act. We've heard some debate tonight about the existing system. There is no existing system. This Act proposes to establish that system. Previous dispositions were made under the Protected Area Strategy, which had very different rules, and one of those rules was a mineral resources assessment before anything could go forward. That's not in this Act, and I don't see any effort to put things like that in this piece of legislation. So I think we need to be careful about what the role of committee is at this point, and it is a clause-by-clause review of this bill, and to ensure it's the best bill that supports the aspirations and goals of our citizens and the best interests of the Indigenous governments that are partners to this legislation. Remember, this bill legislation can only really be used by, or the nomination phase can only be really used by Indigenous government organizations and public governments, or the public government, the GNWT. So this is a very closed bill in that regard. And as it is so closed and only really focused on supporting governments, I think it's important that we bring this process, especially the nomination process, to the public as soon as possible. So the deal isn't fully cooked before it is brought forward into the establishment phase and the candidate stage, because that's when the ball starts rolling. And as we've seen with some of these other conservation moves, it's sometimes hard to make compromises and slow things down in order to ensure the fullness of public discussion. So I think all of these efforts are to greatly expedite the process, improve clarity, and it is entirely a new feature of the regulation, or of the regime that this bill seeks to set up, and it's entirely appropriate that we try to improve it as much as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Further to the motion, Mr. Nakamayak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, 90 days sometimes could be a rush, and look at the 4 years that we're going through, and we're still negotiating some things, and some things take time to develop something good. this, I wouldn't say the mandate, but the outlook on some organizations is to lock up Canada, lock up our resources, for access and development, whether they're on Indigenous lands or even, in some of the waters we share with the United States and the Yukon. I think, given that 90 days, I think that the margins are too small for for Indigenous governments to move around and to work. Like I say, when we develop acts, when we develop agreements, whether they're onshore or offshore, wherever they may be, sometimes they take up to 10 years, and 10 years in life is really a short time, but you need to give it the right time that it needs to. And even for organizations to grow, there might be land swaps that also take time. Look at the Inuviatuk Highway and the time that it's taken with the Nunavut Land Administration and the GNWT to swap the lands and to do it right. And I think this is moving too fast, so I'm not going to support this, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Nakamaiak. And to close, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think I just want to be very clear. This doesn't set a 90-day time frame for the development of a nomination. This sets a 90-day time frame for the minister to make a decision once a nomination is received. That nomination, the development of the nomination could take years, as my colleague, the honourable member for Nunakput said, it could take years. But this is setting a 90-day time frame for the minister to make a decision once a nomination is received. And that's to make sure that the process moves along quickly. It's also to make sure that third parties don't come in and establish interests in an area. Yeah, I think there's some misunderstanding of what the 90-day period is really all about. Mr. Chair, I'd like to request a recorded vote again. Thank you.
Thank you. The member has requested a recorded vote. Question has been called. All those in favor, please raise your hands.
The member for Frame Lake, the member for Cam Lake,
All those opposed.
the member for Sawtoo, the member for Nunakput.
All right, thank you. Once again, the vote is tied, and for the same reasons that I provided before, I will be leaving this open for the opportunity for further debate at Committee of the Whole. I vote against the motion, and the motion is defeated. All right. Thank you, committee. Right. Thank you. Okay, committee to clause 10 as amended. Does committee agree?
Nay.
Agreed? Okay, thank you. Committee agrees. Clause 11. Committee?
Agreed.
Thank you. Agreed. Clause 12. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that subclause 12(2) of Bill 38 be amended by deleting paragraphs A to C and substituting the following. A description of the boundary of the area that identifies the size of the area and any portions of the area that are settlement lands or other private lands, and a map of the area. B, the date of the approval of the area. C, the manner of interim protection for the area, including the duration of interim protection and copies of any instruments referred to in paragraph 11, brackets L, brackets E. D, a summary of known value of the area. E, a description of how the area meets the purpose of this act. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. The motion is in order. To the motion? Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, what this does is just create additional information that needs to be filed about a candidate area on the public registry. And this, for me, the most important thing is in this list is a description of how the area meets the purpose of this act. so that there's some rationale provided on the public registry. I think this is good work to just make sure that things are more accountable and transparent, and I support it. And I believe this was brought forward by the NGOs, and I think this is a good thing to do to improve the bill. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Before we move further, Mr. Testart, in reading it in, can you please reread subclause C at the end when you refer to in paragraph 11, 1E, you read it as L.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes. Would you like me just to read that section? C, the manner of interim protection for the area, including the duration of interim protection and copies of any instruments referred to in paragraph 11.1E. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Further to the motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? Thank you. Motion passes unanimously. Does the minister concur with the amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
The minister concurs with the amendment. Thank you, Minister. Committee to Clause 12 as amended. Mr. Nakimayak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I move that subclause 12 brackets 3 of Bill 38 be amended and the following substituted brackets 3. If there's a land use planning board or body with a role related to an existing land use plan or a land use plan being developed in a region that includes any part of the candidate protected area, the minister shall without delay give notice to the board or body of the candidate protected area approval and provide a description of the boundary or a map of the area and take any steps that are necessary to fulfill all requirements with the land use planning board set out in the applicable land resources and self-government agreement. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Nakimayak. To the motion. Sorry, the motion is in order. To the motion. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I mentioned in my opening remarks how certainly when I went through the bill, one of the lenses that I used was ensuring that co-management was properly integrated into the protected areas process moving forward. We did notice that there was some differing treatment of land use planning boards as compared to renewable resources boards. So what this does is make sure that a land use planning board is treated equally compared to renewable resources boards. So all we did was lift out the wording at the end and take steps that are necessary to fulfill all requirements and so on, and lift that into the land use planning board section. So just ensuring that there was equal treatment of the two co-management streams going forward. Thanks, Mr. Chair. I support it.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Further to the motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? Thank you. Motion passes unanimously. Does the minister concur with the amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
The minister concurs with the amendment. Thank you, Minister. Committee to Clause 12 as amended. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Clause 13?
Agreed.
Thank you. Clause 14? Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that subclause 14 brackets 3 of Bill 38 be amended in each of the paragraphs, brackets E and Z.5 brackets, by striking out and maintenance of the protected area and substituting maintenance, restoration, conservation, or protection of the protected area. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. The motion is in order to the motion. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'd want to recognize the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society NWT chapter for suggesting this language. It does reflect best practices. It's used in some other Canadian jurisdictions, and all it does is add in some additional items that could be considered in an establishment agreement. You know, why do we establish these areas? Well, it might include reasons related to restoration and conservation. So I support this motion. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. To the motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? Thank you. Motion passes unanimously. Does the minister concur with the amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
The minister concurs with the amendment. Thank you, minister. Committee to Clause 14 as amended. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I move that subclause 14's bracket 3 of Bill 38 be amended by adding the following after paragraph F. F1, the required roles, if any, of any renewable resources boards under any applicable land, resources, and self-government agreements, and the relationship between the renewable resources boards and the management board. F2, the required roles, if any, of any land use planning boards or bodies, and the relationship between the land use planning boards or bodies and the management board. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. The motion is in order to the motion. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So this just adds some other items that can be considered in an establishment agreement. Actually, I think it's more than can. An establishment agreement may include provisions. So this is to ensure that there would be some consideration of what role the renewable resources boards or land use planning boards or bodies might have related to a protected area moving into the future. So this is our effort to better integrate co-management, and I support the motion. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Further to the motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? Motion passes unanimously. Does the minister concur with the amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Minister concurs with the amendment. Thank you, Minister. Committee to Clause 14 as amended. Does committee agree? Thank you. To Clause 15, does committee agree? Thank you. Clause 16, Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that subclause 16 brackets 4 of Bill 38 be deleted and the following substituted for if there's a land use planning body. Sorry, I'll start over, Mr. Chair. I move that subclause 16 brackets 4 of Bill 38 be deleted and the following substituted for if there's a land use planning board or body with a role related to an existing land use plan or a land use plan being developed in a region that includes any part of a candidate protected area, the minister shall, without delay, give notice of the intention to establish a protected area under Section 17 to that board or body before the protected area is established, and provide a description of the boundary or a map of the area, and shall ensure that any requirements with respect to any land use planning board or body are fulfilled before establishing a protected area. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. The motion is in order. To the motion, Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is an effort on part of the committee to bring more consistency to the bill's interactions with co-management bodies in the Northwest Territories. It's well-established fact that our co-management system is a very effective and collaborative regulatory regime, and in all areas where this bill interacts with that regime, committee feels that it's important to ensure that the bill respects those oftentimes constitutionally protected and entrenched agreements and the bodies that flow forth or spring forth from those agreements. So this is designed to do that, and I hope we will see it carry. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Next I have Mr. O'Reilly.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Similar to my colleague from Cam Lake, what we're doing is adding some wording at the end of this clause to ensure that any requirements with respect to land use planning are fulfilled before establishing a protected area. So it's just recognizing that there are some other, through the land rights agreements, processes set up, and that the protected areas process will respect and work with those processes and making sure that they're followed. So I support the amendment, and it's just consistent with the wording that appears in other parts of the bill, particularly around the nomination process and so on. So it's just to build in consistency. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? Thank you. The motion passes unanimously. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, I do, Mr. Chair.
The minister concurs. Thank you, Minister. Committee to Clause 16 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agreed.
Thank you. Clause 17, committee agree? Thank you. Clause 18, Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Clause 18 of Bill 38 be amended by deleting paragraph brackets A and substituting the following. Brackets A. The Mets and bounds description of the area that identifies the size of the area and any portions of the area that are settlement lands or private lands, comma, and a map of the area. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. The motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? Thank you. Motion passes unanimously. Does the minister concur with the amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
The minister concurs. Thank you, minister. Committee to Clause 18 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agreed.
Thank you. To Clause 19, committee agree? Thank you. Clause 20, Mr. Nakamayak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I move that Clause 20 of the Bill 38 be deleted and the following substituted. 20 brackets 1. The minister may, with respect to the management operation of protected areas established under this Act, A, enter into funding agreements, and B, establish a special purpose fund that is defined in the Financial Administration Act and accept donations for deposit into the fund. 2, the minister shall, within 180 days following the end of each fiscal year, table with the Legislative Assembly a report of any special purpose fund established under subsections brackets 1 that includes A, the total amount deposited into the fund in the preceding fiscal year and the purpose for the deposit. B, disbursements from the fund in the preceding fiscal year, the recipients and the purpose for each disbursement, and C, the value of the fund at the end of the preceding fiscal year. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Nakamayak. The motion is in order. To the motion. I have Mr. O'Reilly first.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. In the original bill, there was really minimal requirements around this special fund. And what this motion does is provide for some greater transparency and accountability around the fund. And this is similar to the treatment that standing committees have given to other special funds established, say, under the 911 legislation or the Western Canada Lotteries Act. Although we all recognize these funds are going to be prudently administered and managed pursuant to the Financial Administration Act. The Financial Administration Act itself really provides for no overt reporting. They don't appear in the public accounts. So what this amendment will do is ensure that there's some public reporting of the money in, the money out, the balance at the end of the year, and that there's a report tabled in the House so it's accessible to all. So I think it's in keeping with our government's move towards open government and so on. So I support the motion. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. To the motion, Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It should be noted that in several other pieces of, or other bills passed by the House, comes to mind the special purpose fund established under the Lotteries Act, the special purpose fund under the 911 legislation. These also include reporting requirements, so part of this motion as well is to be consistent with other laws that have been brought forward and passed by the Assembly to ensure that there's transparency in financial reporting when it comes to the establishment of these special purpose funds. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. To the motion? To the motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? Thank you. Motion carries unanimously. Does the minister concur with the amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Committee to Clause 20 as amended. Does committee agree? Thank you. Clauses 21 to 23, committee agree? Thank you. Clause 24, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I move that Clause subclause 24 brackets 2 of Bill 38 be amended by A, striking out the period at the end of paragraph E and substituting a semicolon, and B, adding the following after paragraph E, F, climate change considerations. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. The motion is in order. To the motion, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So there's a lot of language there to do a small thing. What this is doing is ensuring that a management plan for a protected area must provide for a number of things. And what we've done here is added climate change considerations. Given that climate change is a real issue, of course, for us, we felt that it was wise to add this into the sort of checklist of things that must be contained in a management plan. And once again, I want to recognize the work of the non-governmental organizations in suggesting this. I know CPAWS did, and I believe the joint NGO submission as well suggested that we add in climate change considerations. So I support the motion, and I think it's in keeping with best practices. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Next up, Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In reviewing the Auditor General's report on climate change, the House observed that an all-government approach is required to ensuring that climate change considerations are appropriately addressed by government at all of its levels, and that ought to include legislation as well. And I think this is the kind of lens we need to look through our laws, policies, and regulations to include things like, climate change in particular. I think everyone can agree tornadoes in Fort Smith are unexpected and unwelcome, and to ensure that we're always considering that whenever we can is going to make stronger legislation that reflects the reality of the world we live in now and the world we're passing on to future generations. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. To the motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? Thank you. Motion passes unanimously. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Minister concurs. Thank you, Minister. Committee to Clause 24 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agreed.
Mr. Testart?
Yes, sorry, Mr. Chair. I do have an amendment here for Section 24. I move that Bill 38 be amended by adding the following after subclause 24, brackets 5. Notice, 6, if there is a land use planning board or body with a role related to an existing land use plan or a land use plan being developed in a region that includes any part of a protected area, the minister shall, without delay, give notice to that board or body of the process of preparing a management plan for the protected area, and shall ensure that any requirements with respect to any land use planning board or body are fulfilled before the management plan is approved. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. The motion is in order. To the motion, Mr. Testart.
Again, thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, this motion is designed to address clarity of the roles of our co-management bodies in our regulatory system and to ensure that the bill interlocks seamlessly with the co-management regime in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. To the motion, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So for anybody who's watching or listening, Section 24 of the bill is really about management plans, and so this is about ensuring that the notice is given to a land use planning board or body that a management plan is being prepared so that they can know about it and have some input, and that the roles or that land use planning requirements are fulfilled. So I support the motion. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Minister concurs with this amendment. Thank you, Minister. Committee to Clause 24 as amended. Mr. Nakamaiak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 38 be amended by adding the following after subclause 24, bracket 6, bracket 7. The minister shall ensure that any requirements with respect to any renewable resources boards as set out in the applicable land, resources, and self-government agreements are fulfilled before the management plan is approved. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Nakamaiak. The motion is in order. To the motion, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Very briefly, in the original bill, there was nothing about the roles for land use planning boards or for renewable resources boards, so this just ensures that renewable resources boards are going to be part of the management planning process for protected area. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Further to the motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? Thank you. Motion passes unanimously. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
I do, Mr. Chair.
Minister concurs. Thank you, Minister. Committee to Clause 24 as amended. Does committee agree? Thank you. Committee to Clause 25. Does committee agree? Thank you. Committee to Clause 26. Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that subclause 26, bracket 3 of Bill 38 be amended by adding, including with an adjacent community after opportunity for public engagement. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. The motion is in order. To the motion, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So, Section 26 of the bill is about making changes to protected areas, and it really deals with the process of reducing the size of a protected area or even deregistering it, basically doing away with it. So in the written submissions that committee received, there was a letter from the city of Yellowknife, and they had asked that they would like to be included in any public engagement around the changes to a protected area that might be near the city. So what this amendment does is include that adjacent communities are to be part of the public engagement process in making any changes to a protected area. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. To the motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? Thank you. Motion passes unanimously. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Minister concurs. Thank you, Minister. Committee to Clause 26 as amended. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I move that subclause 26 brackets 5 of Bill 38 be deleted and the following substituted. Bracket 5, if there's a land use planning board or body with a role related to an existing land use plan or a land use plan being developed in a region that includes any part of a protected area, the minister shall, without delay, give notice to the board or body of a change in size or deregistration of a protected area under this section, and shall ensure that any requirements with respect to any land use planning board or body are fulfilled before making any change in size or deregistering a protected area. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. The motion is in order. To the motion, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I'm starting to sound a little bit like a broken record here, but what this amendment does is ensure that it's just not notice that's given to a land use planning board or a board or a body, but that the requirements with respect to any land use planning board or body are actually fulfilled. So I support the intention of this. I think it just better incorporates co-management into the protected areas process. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. To the motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? Thank you. Motion passes unanimously. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
The minister concurs. Thank you, Minister. Committee to Clause 26 as amended. Does committee agree? Thank you. Clauses 27 to 30. Committee agree? Committee, we're going to go to finish up the next two sections of clauses, and then we'll go for a break. Okay, so clauses 27 to 30. Committee agree? Thank you. And clauses 31 to 35. Committee agree? All right, thank you, committee. At this time, we've been sitting in here for some time, and I respect that some folks might have to use the washroom and coffee up, water up, get some fresh air, and we'll reconvene in, let's say, 7 minutes, exactly 1:45. Thank you. All right, committee. We'll reconvene our clause-by-clause review of Bill 38. And when we left at, Clause 36. Clause 36, Mr. Nakamayak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that subparagraph 36, brackets 1, bracket A, brackets Roman numerals 2 of Bill 38 be amended by adding and potential mitigation of those impacts after of the protected area. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Nakamayak. The motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? Thank you. The motion passes unanimously. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Minister concurs. Thank you, Minister. Committee to Clause 36 as amended. Mr. Testart.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I move that that the French version of subclause 36.2 of Bill 38 be amended by striking out identification de tout aire and substituting identification de tout secteur. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. The motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? Thank you. The motion passes unanimously. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Oui.
Minister concurs with the amendment. Thank you, Minister. Committee to Clause 36 as amended. Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 38 be amended by adding the following after subclause 36, bracket 2, brackets 3. The minister shall ensure that there is an opportunity for public engagement either by the management board for the area or, as the minister considers appropriate, before the identification of any area under subsection brackets 1. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. The motion is in order. To the motion. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, the way that the bill was originally drafted, there was no provision for any kind of public involvement in a process for putting a corridor for transmission or transportation through a protected area. So I know that a number of the NGOs expressed some concern around that, and the purpose of this amendment is to ensure that something as important as putting a corridor through a protected area, there's going to be an opportunity for public engagement, and I support this. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? Thank you. The motion passes unanimously. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
I do, Mr. Chair.
Minister concurs. Thank you. Committee to Clause 36 as amended. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 38 be amended by adding the following under subclause 36, bracket 3. Bracket 4, if there's a land use planning board or body with a role related to an existing land use plan that includes any part of a protected area, the minister shall, before the identification of any area under subsection 1, ensure that any requirements with respect to any land use planning board or body are fulfilled. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. The motion is in order. To the motion. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So once again, we're dealing with the section of the bill that deals with corridor transportation, transmission or transportation corridors through a protected area that's already been established. What this clause does is ensure that land use planning board or body as a recognized co-management authority would have the ability to hopefully participate in that process, but that the requirements that are set out with respect to any land use planning body or board are actually fulfilled. So this is again about integrating co-management into the legislation, and I think it's a sound addition, and I support it. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? Thank you. The motion passes unanimously. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, I do, Mr. Chair.
Minister concurs with the amendment. Thank you, Minister. Committee to Clause 36 as amended. Mr. Nakamayak.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 38 be amended by adding the following after subclause 36 brackets 4. Brackets 5, the minister shall ensure that any requirements with respect to any renewable resources boards as set out on the applicable land resources and self-government agreements are fulfilled before the identification of any area under subsection 1. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Nakamayak. The motion is in order. To the motion, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Once again, this is in the spirit of better integrating co-management into the legislation, particularly around transmission transportation corridors through protected areas, renewable resources boards, as established under the land rights agreements, already have some jurisdiction with regard to wildlife, plants, and so on. And it's only consistent with those agreements that we ensure that there's that they're recognized in this process of putting a transportation transmission corridor through a protected area, and that the agreements themselves are fulfilled as part of that process. Thanks, Mr. Chair, and I support it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. To the motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? Motion passes unanimously. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Minister concurs with the amendment. Thank you, Minister. Committee to Clause 36 as amended. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 38 be amended by adding the following after subclause 36, brackets 5, bracket 6. The minister's reasons for a decision to identify an area under the section shall be recorded in the Protected Areas Registry. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. To the motion, sorry, the motion is in order. To the motion, Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This amendment ensures there's a public reporting requirement to report any decisions made under this section respecting transportation or transmission corridors in the public registry. So it's clear why decisions were made in the exercise of this discretion. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. To the motion, Mr. O'Reilly.
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you. This is a very important amendment to the bill, in my view, in that the way that the bill was originally put together, Section 36 is quite remarkable in that it's a notwithstanding clause. So notwithstanding anything else that's already in the legislation, the minister can override that and establish a transmission or transportation corridor through an established protected area. So that's rather extraordinary powers in my view. And what this clause will do is ensure that there's a reasons for decision when that discretion is exercised, so that there's some greater accountability and transparency. And of course, in addition, it will also ensure that that decision is put on the public registry and made available to the public. And for those reasons, I support this. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. To the motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? Thank you. The motion passes unanimously. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
I do, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. The minister concurs. Committee to Clause 36 as amended. Does committee agree? Thank you. Clauses 37 to 40. Does committee agree? Thank you. Clauses 41 to 45. Does committee agree? Thank you. Clauses 46 to 50. Does committee agree? Thank you. Clauses 51 to 55. Does committee agree? Thank you. Clauses 56 to 60. Does committee agree? Thank you. Clauses 61 to 65. Does committee agree? Thank you. Clauses 66 to 70. Does committee agree? Thank you. Clauses 71 to 75. Does committee agree? Thank you. Clauses 76 to 80, does committee agree? Thank you. Clauses 81 to 85, does committee agree? Thank you. Clauses 86 to 90, does committee agree? Thank you. Clauses 91 to 95, does committee agree? Thank you. Clauses 96 to 97, does committee agree? Thank you. Clause 98, Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that subclause 98 brackets 1 of Bill 38 be amended by renumbering the paragraphs brackets A as paragraph brackets A dot number 2 and adding the following before the renumbered paragraphs. Brackets A, setting out legally binding agreements for the purposes of the definition land resources and self-government agreements in subsection 1, brackets 1. And brackets A, point 1, setting out any information required to be included in the protected areas registry under subsection 9, brackets 2. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. The motion is in order. To the motion, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So the section of the bill that we're dealing with is the regulation-making authority of Commissioner and Executive Council or Cabinet. And Part A of the amendment is really consequential to the addition that we made way back at the beginning of the evening, where we had a motion that would allow the minister to prescribe, I think, other agreements. And so essentially what this does is establish the regulation-making authority to do that. The second part is about allowing for regulations to be prepared with regard to information that would be included in the public registry. So once again, it's just enumerating in this section of the bill things we've already agreed to in other amendments. So it's just consistent, making sure that that's set out here, and I support it. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? Thank you. Motion passes unanimously. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
I do, Mr. Chair.
The minister concurs with the amendment. Thank you, Minister. Committee to Clause 98 as amended. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 38 be amended by adding the following after subclause 98 brackets 2. 3, the minister shall give notice of any proposed new or amended regulations to be made under this section to Indigenous governments or organizations in the Northwest Territories and relevant renewable resource boards and land use planning boards or bodies at least 30 days before those regulations are made, and shall A, provide an opportunity for those Indigenous governments or organizations, renewable resource boards and land use planning boards or bodies to present their views to the minister, and B, consider fully and impartially any views presented under paragraph A. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. The motion is in order. To the motion, Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. During the Standing Committee's review of, or public consultations on Bill 38, we heard that there was a strong desire and need for direct involvement in the regulation-making authority under Bill 38 and other post-devolution bills from virtually every Indigenous government and co-management board that presented or made a written submission to the committee. And this was also echoed by the civil society in the form of non-governmental organizations that made representations to the Standing Committee. The evidence committee has collected shows that representations were made directly to the minister about such direct involvement in regulation making during the co-drafting process months before Bill 38 was brought before the House. Some Indigenous governments went so far to suggest specific wording and precedents. These positions were represented again before the Standing Committee during its review of Bill 38. The evidence shows that the following Indigenous governments, co-management boards, and organizations have requested direct involvement in the development of regulations under a Protected Areas Act. The Deitcho First Nations, the Dene Nation, the Gwich'in Land Use Planning Board, the Gwich'in Renewable Resources Board, the Katladichi First Nation, the North Slave Métis Alliance, Northwest Territories Métis Alliance, the Sato Renewable Resources Board, the Sato Secretariat Incorporated, the Tlicho Government, and the Wikiji Renewable Resources Board. And again, a number of non-governmental organizations, Alternatives North, Canadian Arctic Resources Committee, Council of Canadians, NWT Chapter, and Ecology North. Involvement in regulation making is consistent with the manner in which Bill 38 itself was developed and a co-drafting exercise pursuant to the Intergovernmental Agreement on Lands and Resources. We further believe that co-management boards also need to be involved, given that their role is underpinned by constitutionally entrenched agreements. So the decision to bring forward this amendment is to ensure the bill reflects those the principles of co-drafting that went into the creation of this legislation, and to ensure that the minister is not fettered in his or the government's ability to bring forward regulations in a cohesive and expedient way, but that notice must be provided, 30 days notice, before those regulations come into force, and that Indigenous governments are given an opportunity to represent their interests in the creation of those regulations. As I said at the outset of this hearing, this review hearing, the Indigenous governments have raised very high expectations around this, and the regulations in this bill are very important. Much of the determination of how this bill will work in practice has been left up to regulations. There's precedent for this in the Northwest Territories. The Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act includes a provision that requires consultation on any regulations made by the Government of Canada respecting the Act. This section is much less burdensome than that. It's not calling for full Section 35 consultations. There's no legal requirement. What this motion represents is a discrete concept separate from full-blown Section 35 consultations, and is about engaging Indigenous governments to ensure that they have meaningful opportunities to engage the minister before the regulations are made a reality. And I think it's a good compromise between what the government's objections were to putting a consultation requirement into regulation-making authority, and what we heard, again, from virtually every Indigenous government that presented before committee, and this includes both signed claims and unsigned claims. And I think that's important, that this represents the totality of experiences that Indigenous governments and organizations have in the Northwest Territories. So I think this is an elegant solution to ensure that Indigenous governments are allowed to participate in regulation making, and it does not unduly fetter the minister's ability to bring forward those regulations. And I look forward to discussing this further and ask that committee support it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. The motion is in order to the motion. Mr. Nakamayak first.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, this is something similar to one of the other motions that my honorable members sitting across had presented earlier. Mr. Chair, I believe that the process is, right now, it's as good as it's going to get. Unless there's something specific, and aligns with Indigenous governments and the Government of Northwest Territories. And, coming from an Indigenous government perspective, we're not going to draft regulations, policy, and everything all the way through together. There's a time and point where the GNWT or the federal government must latch off of Indigenous governments so that we can actually develop these. And, the input is great. I think what this may, just looking at the big picture from a 30,000-foot level, I'm looking at IBAs, benefit agreements with Indigenous governments. There's a possibility somehow that those confidential, and they need to remain confidential due to the fact that, this is sometimes maybe on Indigenous governments' lands, and we need to respect that. I think this is a side door to opening that up and making that public. And I myself do not support this. Looking at that way. It's great that we have this input from everybody supporting it, but there's a time and point where we must look at the reality rather than, I would say, opening up a can of worms or something like this. Is very similar to that, Mr. Chair. So we're already making, Indigenous governments are making regulations with departments that we as regular members do not see, and sometimes don't even hear of. I hear them once in a while, being an New Valley beneficiary, and some of the issues that we work on together, aligning in my region with the New Valley Regional Corporation, with the New Valley Land and Water Board, with the Development Corporation, with the Land Administration. So I think this motion, I don't support this the way it is. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Nakamayak. Mr. McNeely?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also agree with the comments made by the member of Nunukput here, and I agree that we have a forum and an engagement referral process that happened and brought us here today with these amendments through consultation. And it's that consultation process that have seemed to work. The players in the group, in the IGC, were the players throughout the territories. And I'm quite satisfied that consultation is already in place. To broaden the players of the group would be, for one thing, costly, and it would share different opinions within the organizations, and it might seem that we as a government are initiating friction or division between the organizations or the land claim settled areas. The land claim settled areas make up 60% of this territory. So for those factors and other factors, and as the previous speaker mentioned, I can't support this motion.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. To the motion, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I think I've heard some misunderstandings of what this is really all about. This is not similar to earlier motions with regard to Section 10 of the bill that set out the minister's discretion in the nomination process. This is about giving notice to Indigenous governments, co-management bodies of a draft regulation. It's not about ministerial discretion. There's nothing in here that fetters the minister's discretion other than a requirement to provide notice and do it 30 days ahead of time. The minister can listen to what everybody says, give it consideration, and at the end of the day, the minister can decide what he or she wants to do. There's nothing in here that fetters the discretion of the minister, in my view. We had detailed written submissions made to us that set out suggested wording of how Indigenous governments can and should be engaged and involved in the regulation making going forward, which were much stronger than the proposal that's on the table right now. So this is, I think, as my colleague from Cam Lake said, an honest effort to try to find some compromise here, which is, I think, what we were asked to do. We've already heard from the Indigenous governments that at least one other department, Industry, Tourism and Investment, is starting to talk about, or even there's a draft terms of reference or a draft agreement on how Indigenous governments are going to be engaged and involved moving forward with the Mineral Resources Act. So this is, I don't think, is really a heck of a lot different. I don't see how, I don't accept that the bill is as good as it's going to get. We've already made about 30 changes to it, very important changes to it. In this section, there's opportunities to improve the regulation-making authority, because right now it's totally at the minister's discretion. This is not as good as it can get. We can and really owe it to our citizens and Indigenous governments to do a lot better. That's why I'm here. I guess I would also say two more points, if I can, Mr. Chair. In many jurisdictions, it's becoming standard practice to provide public notice around making regulations. They do it with the federal government. There's a gazette. There's usually a standard 30, 60-day period for public comment on draft regulations. Unfortunately, we don't have a process in general for allowing for public comment on regulations. And maybe that's something else we need to think about moving forward as a government in the spirit of open government. But the last point I guess I want to say is that, the minister, at the beginning of the hearing, when he was asked about the Intergovernmental Council and what role Indigenous governments might have moving forward, he said, well, the Intergovernmental Council is going to be undertaking a lessons learned process. That's great. We don't know when that's going to finish. The problem is we got a bill before us right now that we need. This is our opportunity to fix this in the bill that will probably become law in a day or two, certainly by Thursday. This is our chance to fix it now. We're not going to get another chance to fix the law itself. I understand that there's maybe some discussions that are going to happen around involvement in regulation making. That's great. But we have to deal with a bill that's before us, and there's nothing in this bill that requires any engagement with Indigenous governments. I would hope and expect that that's going to be the case, but there's nothing in the bill that requires that. And there are, as my colleague from Cam Lake said, a number of important areas that are going to be detailed in regulations. So we need to fix this now, and this is, I think, a compromise that will allow for Indigenous governments to have a say, at least an opportunity to know about and have a say as regulations are rolled out, and co-management bodies as well. And I think it's a reasonable compromise. I wish that we could all agree that this could move forward. I suspect it's not going to happen here tonight, and it's going to play out on the floor of the House. And our residents, they need to know where we stand as individual MLAs on what role Indigenous governments, co-management bodies should play in developing regulations around our land and water. And we have an opportunity to fix this now. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. To close, Mr. Testart.
Thank you for allowing me to close the debate, Mr. Chair. I just want to address some concerns that have been raised by other members in considering this motion. This motion does not impact the confidentiality of impact benefit agreements or similar confidences of Indigenous governments. To be clear, it requires the government of the Northwest Territories to provide notice. It does not require any information to be shared with the government from Indigenous governments. So I'm not sure why that representation was made. It has nothing to do with IPAs, and it certainly has nothing to do with opening up it's confidential information possessed by Indigenous governments. So I want to be very clear that this motion does not impact that at all. Another concern that was raised is it broadens the players in the group that participated in the work on this and other legislation. Well, that group that I enumerated, some of those organizations who communicated with us, they are not all signatories to the devolution agreement, and the GNWT has agreed to bring them into the technical working group. So the government of the Northwest Territories has already broadened the circle larger than the devolution signatories and larger than the parties of the intergovernmental agreement in the efforts to seek meaningful reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and nations. And I applaud the government for doing so, and this motion continues along that path. So if members have a concern that this is broadening, that this motion represents broadening that group, then they should also share those concerns about the technical working group and bring those up with the Premier and Cabinet, because they're the ones who made this the executive decision to do so. And reflecting as well on the role of the Standing Committee, many of us considered, what is our role when it comes to these co-drafted bills? And I think our role is very clear. When the process has to move forward quickly to see the legislation passed, it's our role to pump the brakes a little, carefully consider what the concerns of the public, and in particular the co-drafting partners, are, and recommend those changes to the Act. And we've already made numerous changes tonight, and this is just another one. But I think the members owe it to carefully consider those concerns, and to say a bill is as good as it's going to get, well, we're here to make sure we have the best possible legislation we can possibly have, and I believe personally that should be based on the feedback we gain from the public, because we're here to represent the public, and we're here to hear their concerns and make sure their concerns are reflected in the laws and policies of the government of the Northwest Territories. And that is what this motion is designed to do. And I will ask for a recorded vote. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. The member has asked for a recorded vote. Motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor?
The member for Cam Lake. The member for Frame Lake.
All those opposed?
The member for Satu. The member for Nunakwa.
Right, thank you. And that leaves us with a tied vote. And for the reasons that I provided earlier, I'll leave this open for the opportunity for further debate at Committee of the Whole. I will vote against the motion, and the motion is defeated. Thank you. Committee to Clause 98 as amended. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 38 be amended by adding the following after subclause 98.3. 4, the minister may enter into one or more agreements with Indigenous governments or organizations in the Northwest Territories and with relevant renewable resource boards and land use planning boards or bodies as to how the Commissioner and Executive Council will engage those parties in exercising the regulation-making powers under this section. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. The motion is in order. To the motion. Mr. Testart.
Thank you. So similar but discrete from the previous motion that was raised. This motion, if carried, would alter the bill to give the minister a new power to enter into agreements with Indigenous governments or other regulatory bodies to formalize any kind of protocol the government establishes in working with those bodies to co-draft regulations or future legislative amendments, whatever protocol is identified. It's wide open. It's again a new power to reflect the co-drafting process, and again, not to insist upon any limits on the minister's authority, but rather give this new power to give comfort to Indigenous governments that there's a clear path in law that allows them to continue to participate in meaningful engagement and co-drafting exercises as it relates to Bill 38. Earlier in the hearing, I asked the minister a question about how the government was going to respond to these concerns, and the response was the Intergovernmental Council will develop a consistent approach to co-drafting legislation and regulations. Well, out of respect for that body and that conversation needs to have happen, I think that this is a very, again, elegant solution that sets up a protocol in law, and once that process is codified at the Intergovernmental Council, this amendment will plug right into that and allow that protocol to flow. And again, it is giving certainty and comfort to our co-drafting partners that there is a clear path in law to ensure that they are able to meaningfully participate in regulation-making authority. But again, there's in no way impacts the internal operations of Indigenous governments. It does not breach or compel any information to be shared, and it does not fetter the minister's discretion in any way. It's a new power, and with that, Mr. Chair, I'll look forward to the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Motion is in order. To the motion. Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I can't see myself supporting this motion for the reasons being that there is 4 land claim settled areas, and the administration within those areas should be respected in the means of proper communication and consultation, and I think that has been done. And the results of that Intergovernmental Council supporting the formation of the council with the players of the council, and for now to amend legislation to undermine and include the sub-organizations to the regional organization would probably create friction in communications. That, and for other reasons, I like I said, I can't support this motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. Anyone further to the motion? Mr. Nakamayak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, like my previous speaker, and coming from a land claims organization, they've negotiated our land claims. There was a story on a newspaper yesterday, or today actually, I believe, about how it took 9-10 years to negotiate the final agreement, and other treaties, whether they're national, or international. I've been fortunate to sit on, to participate in an international fisheries agreement. And Mr. Chair, when I see the wordings after with Indigenous governments or organizations in Northwest Territories, and I've heard NGOs approximately 13 times this evening, and it would be a grave danger actually to Indigenous governments who work very hard to negotiate their land claims and, you know, and actually implement them as well too. You know, Mr. Chair, at the Arctic Council, some non-Arctic states are observers of the Arctic Council, and they are not allowed to vote, and I think we should follow suit with that. This could be dangerous to land claims agreements. I come from my region that has oil and gas, natural gas. You know, there are a lot of reserves there, and you know, if we allow organizations like that to close things up or continue to close up the water, the land, you know, the resources that we have rights to, could be very dangerous. You know, and also inputs, how are we going to give an NGO, I'm just looking for an example, how are we going to give an NGO similar powers to the Inuvialuit or to SSI or to the Gwich'in? And I'm just speaking of the northern communities that I'm very, very familiar with, and I'm getting more and more familiar with the Cleat-Show and other agreements in the southern part of the territory. And Mr. Chair, I have a really hard time with this actually, and I think we need to look at this long and hard and see, well, what are we actually really doing here? And Mr. Chair, for those reasons, I won't support this motion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Nakamayak. To the motion, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think it's important to respond to some of the issues I've heard, but I guess I'd like to start with, you know, the drafting of this clause. This is not mandatory. It says the minister may enter into one or more agreements. The minister doesn't have to. It's not mandatory. It just gives the minister the authority to enter into agreements to sort out how these co-management bodies, how the Indigenous governments can be engaged, involved in regulation making moving forward. I don't understand how this could be construed in any way to fetter the minister's discretion. It could never be construed in any way to take away from what the established land rights agreements already do. And, you know, if you don't believe me, all you have to do is look at the other clauses of this bill. At the beginning of the bill, there is a clause that says this act should be is to be interpreted in a manner consistent with recognition, affirmation of existing Aboriginal treaty rights, Section 35 rights. Furthermore, if there's a conflict or an inconsistency between the provision of this act or the regs, the provision of a land, resources, and self-government agreement, the land, resources, and self-government agreement prevails to the extent of any conflict. There's no way that this permissive clause in any way can take anything away from an existing land rights agreement. Then I heard another set of comments around how this is supposed to be giving NGOs some sort of role, or that powers to Indigenous governments. NGOs aren't even mentioned in the wording of this clause. This was not put forward by any NGOs. This was an effort by a couple of committee members to find a way to encourage and promote the co-drafting process moving forward into the development of regulations. That's all this is about. Trying to maintain and encourage that good working relationship that's already been established. I don't know why anybody would think this is not a good idea. There's some discussions already going on with the Intergovernmental Council about lessons learned. They may come up with an agreement themselves with the territorial government. Great. All this clause would do is give the minister the ability to enter into that agreement, encourage that kind of working relationship moving forward. I think this is a good and sound amendment, and I really look forward to the debate and discussion moving forward onto the floor. And I would really like, again, to hear what the minister has to say about this. I can't do that right now, but I look forward to his views on this on the floor of the House, because I'll be asking him what the process is moving forward. This is permissive. This is not mandatory. This is a way of encouraging the good working relationship going forward. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. To close debate, Mr. Testart.
Thank you again for the opportunity to close the debate, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to quote from a few of the submissions that we received. State Show First Nations, quote, "DFN expects will be fully involved and resourced to participate in the development of regulations under this legislation." Katladichi First Nation, quote, "KFN recommends including provisions in land and resource legislation to require the minister to collaborate with IGOs," that's Indigenous government organizations, "and renewable resource management boards prior to developing regulation or proposing future amendments." Satu Secretariat Incorporated. The SSI reiterates its request that the draft bills be amended to confirm that their respective regulations would be made in consultation with the SSI and other Indigenous groups and organizations. So in their own words, Mr. Chair, Indigenous governments have raised this concern, including those in signed and unsigned claiming areas. This, again, is a permissive clause that doesn't require anything. It creates a new option for the minister to codify that and, again, create a clear pathway in law for Indigenous governments to meaningfully participate in the regulation-making authority. It seems that tonight, members have raised concerns around NGOs, which are not present in this motion at all. Organization, I think that might be what's tripping people up, but inconsistent with the language in the rest of the bill. The bill uses Indigenous governments or organizations to refer to Indigenous governments, and that's what's reflected here in this clause. And I want to assure anyone who is concerned about this that non-government organizations are not represented at all or contemplated at all. And again, I think it's important that we listen to the submissions that the public and our Indigenous partners in this legislation brought forward, and rather than speak on their behalf, listen to the words they say and that they brought before committee and act on those words. It's very easy to say what we believe, but it's more important to consider what we are being told by the members of the public who took the time and effort to attend our committee hearings and provide detailed and meaningful engagement with this committee, and that is what has resulted in this motion tonight. And Mr. Chair, I would like to ask for a recorded vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. The member has asked for a recorded vote. All those in favor?
The member for Cam Lake, the member for Frame Lake,
All those opposed?
the member for Sawtoo, the member for Nunako.
Thank you. The vote is tied. I will leave open the opportunity for further debate at Committee of the Whole. I vote against the motion, and the motion is defeated. Committee to Clause 98 as amended. Does committee agree? Does committee agree? Agreed. Clause 99, committee agree? Thank you. Clause 100, committee agreed? Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 38 be amended by adding the following after Clause 100, 100.1. On the coming into force of Section 11, the area set out in Land Withdrawal Order Denage Wakere, North Arm of Great Slave Lake, registered as regulation numbered R054-2014 under Northwest Territories Lands Act, is deemed to be approved as a candidate protected area under Section 11 of this Act. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. The motion is in order to the motion. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So we're dealing with the transitional provisions of the bill, and there's a general clause here that recognizes areas that are already established under our Territorial Parks Act and sort of grandfathers one category of those into the protected areas legislation. But what this amendment and some that may follow really deal with is to recognize that there are some areas that have already been gone through the old protected areas strategy that have land withdrawals and other arrangements perhaps already negotiated in relation to them, and just recognize the work that's already been done and say that they are recognized as a candidate area, as I understand it, rather than have to start at square one and go through the entire nomination process again. So it's just picking up some of these areas where they've already arrived at and ensuring that they are grandfathered and integrated into the legislation that we will consider. So I support this. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. The motion is in order to the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? Thank you. The motion passes unanimously. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, I do, Mr. Chair.
The minister concurs. Thank you, Minister. Committee to Clause 100 as amended. Mr. Nakamaiak.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I move that Bill 38 be amended by adding the following after Clause 100.1, 100.2 on coming into force of Section 11, the area set out in land withdrawal order, brackets Taidene Nene, east arm of Great Slave Lake, proposed territorial protected areas, registered as regulation numbered R-021-2019 under the Northwest Territories Lands Act. This is deemed to be approved as a candidate protected under Section 11 of this Act. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Nakamaiak. The motion is in order to the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? Thank you. Motion passes unanimously. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
I do, Mr. Chair.
The minister concurs. Thank you, Minister. Committee to Clause 100 as amended. Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 38 be amended by adding the following after Clause 100.2, 100.3. On the following it into on the coming into force of Section 11, the area set out in Zone 65 as read, brackets Ramparts River and wetlands of the Sahtu Land Use Plan as it reads at the time and Section 11 comes into force is deemed to be approved as a candidate protected area under Section 11 of the Act. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. The motion is in order to the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Motion passes unanimously. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
I do, Mr. Chair.
The minister concurs. Thank you, Minister. Committee to Clause 100 as amended. Does committee agree? Thank you. Clause 101. Does committee agree? Thank you. Committee agrees. Okay, committee. We will now return to the preamble, which can be found on page 8. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a question for the minister on the preamble. A decision was made by the department in drafting the bill to include preambles. Various standing committees have heard representations that preambles are not part of departmental policy. So I'm wondering if you could shed some light on why this bill, these ENR bills, this one in particular, included a preamble when my understanding at least is that the policy of government is to not include preambles in legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Ms. McLaughlin? McLaughlin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sorry about that.
Yes, so there is an approach with respect to preambles as well as principles and purpose clauses because typically the bill should, with its operative provisions, be self-containing and explain everything that the bill is intended to do. At times, it may be inserting other components to reading the bill that are perhaps might confuse other portions of the text. So with that stated, though, if it is decided that a preamble is important to set out a historical background, for example, then a preamble can be included. And the Interpretation Act speaks to the preamble and its status vis-a-vis the rest of the legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My apologies for stumbling through the answer. It's a little late for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Further, Mr. Testart?
So just one further point on this, Mr. Chair. Ultimately, who makes the decision to include a preamble in a given bill? Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. McLaughlin?
The drafting is done on the instruction of the department. So on advice that's provided with respect to the use of preambles, purpose, and principles, ultimately the department, in considering any direction there may be across government with respect to their use, would instruct on the use of a preamble. Thank you.
Thank you. Further, Mr. Testart?
I have a motion, Mr. Chair, that the preamble of Bill 38 be amended in the second recital by adding "and lands use planning boards" after renewable resources boards. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. The motion is in order. To the motion? To the motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? Thank you. The motion passes unanimously. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Committee to the preamble as amended. Does committee agree? Thank you. We will now return to the bill number and title, Bill 38, Protected Areas Act. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. The bill as a whole, does committee agree? Just one moment. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. With your indulgence and that of committee, I neglected to ask one question of the minister. It's a short one. I'd like to know what the intention of the minister is with regard to having the bill come into force once it's passed in the House. Is it going to be done immediately and in its entirety? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. McLaughlin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So section, clause 101 of the bill includes the commencement provision, which provides that the act or any provision may come into force or will come into force on a day or days to be fixed by order of the commissioner. So that means that the day will be fixed by a subsequent order signed by the commissioner. And typically, the date is set by ensuring that implementation components are in place first. So regulations that need to be drafted to operationalize the bill, for example, is a factor that legislation division is involved in, but there may be other implementation steps that the department goes through before it instructs on the coming into force. And whether all of it comes into force at once or in components often relates to whether there's a need for staged implementation or whether there are parts of the bill that are ready to proceed, whereas other parts need more time. So it's technically it's possible to do a bit of both, but whether it's going to come in all at once or at different times depend on the department's implementation plan. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Further to that, Mr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So our intent on this bill, if passed, is to bring it into force quite quickly. As mentioned in previous statements around the room earlier, there's lots of work that's underway, lots of work that we'd like to do, lots of work that's a priority of the residents and the Indigenous governments around the territory. So our intent is to bring this into force quite quickly.
Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. Further, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks. Yeah, I think there's some urgency on this. I'll probably ask it on the floor again as well. That may be a little bit more precision, but I just want to give you guys a heads up. But I appreciate the explanation from Ms. McLaughlin. I understood that, but I just want to get it on the record. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Okay, I'll go to the bill as a whole. Does committee agree? All right, thank you. Does the committee agree that Bill 38 Protected Areas Act is now ready for consideration in committee of the whole? Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move Bill 38, Protected Areas Act, be reported to the Assembly as read for consideration in the Committee of the Whole as amended and reprinted. Thank you.
Thank you. Motion is in order. Motion is on the floor. To the motion.
Question.
Question has been called. All those in favor? Thank you. The motion passes unanimously. Motion is carried. Bill 38, Protected Areas Act, will be reported to the Assembly as ready for consideration in Committee of the Whole as amended and reprinted. Therefore, I want to thank you, Minister. Thank you to your officials, and thanks to everyone else who is coming here. This actually says this afternoon. This evening. And with that, we can be adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Before we do that, I have some commentary from Mr. Testart first, with regard to the recorded votes earlier.
Well, how would you like to proceed, Mr. Chair? Do you want to call for it, or do you want me to move a motion?
If you are okay with the idea that the recorded votes by agreement from committee simply be added to the report, then that's the process we can take and not have to go through a motion. Would committee agree?
Agreed.
Okay. And therefore, we can be adjourned. Thank you, everyone.